What's going on, monkeys? Today we're going to take a look at STRAWBEARD, a very hot deck right now. We saw it have an outstanding performance at regionals these past few weeks, and I feel like it just needs to be talked about. So I'm going to show you guys not only how to play the deck optimally, but how you should be playing against it. So let's get right into it here. So firstly, I'm going to start off by showing you guys Alexander Tash's second place regionals list. He came second place in 2 of the recent online regionals, so I figure what better deck list to show you than his. And I've got it pulled up right here. So as you guys can see, 4 Namis, which are absolutely standard. It is literally, I'm not going to say almost always, it is literally always going to be your turn 1 play if it can be. 16 2K counters, a bunch of searchable 6K bodies, some rush cards, and of course the MVP of the deck, Edward 9-Gate. Now, I want to jump into what he changed his list to be for the second regionals after he came second place at the first one. And the difference between the two lists, as you can see here, are the 3 Nikos and the guard points come out, and the 4 King Do and the extra Vistas come in. So I really do agree more with this second list than the first, and I will try to explain why here. So I believe you'll end up going first in most of your matches. If you lose the die roll, which will likely happen 50% of the time, you're going to end up going first. So for 50% of your games right there, you're going first. If you're playing against a Zoro or a Newgate and you win the die roll, you're going to choose to go first because you want to drop Newgate on 9, because that is literally the most important thing to do in this deck. So this means that your turns curves are something like 1 Nami, 3 Vista, 5 King Do, 7 Ace, and 9 Newgate. That's right. The addition of King Do was probably because you get so much more value dropping a 5 cost on 5 Dawn over a 4 cost Frankie or Luffy on 5 Dawn. But don't get me wrong, dropping the Luffy or Frankie isn't terrible. You drop the Luffy for 4 and you use that extra mana upon your leader and swing for 7, which is much less likely that they're going to counter out of it. So it isn't terrible. It's just, this is my assumption to why the King Doos came in. So the second thing to know is when to trade board. You almost never want to trade into board unless it's high value or unless it's a mirror match or against green. Green is important to secure board kills because cards like Okiku and Yamato have such high attack stats. It makes them able to chip away at your hand really easily with every attack. And they're barely committing any Dawn for those attacks, so again, those really need to go quickly. But for the most part, you almost always want to go face. It's a very aggro deck, and it forces your opponent to attack into your board, or else they're literally going to lose the game. Which brings me to my next point. Saving your life cards. It is so critically important to discard counters to prevent yourself from taking life, especially in the early game. The biggest difference that you'll see between a good whitebeard player versus a bad one is that a good player won't be afraid to use a radical beam early to save them from taking a life. Sometimes using a radical for 2k might win you the game because you know you're playing a Newgate in the next couple of turns and you won't have the Dawn up to play those radicals. So the situation does come up. Another critical thing is that you can't be afraid to pitch a 2k counter to stop a 6k attack at your leader if you have no 1ks left. This again is especially critical in the early game. Your 1k counters do dry out quickly with this deck because all your 1k counters are your playable cards, right? Your Frankies, your Luffys, all those cards, you're playing them or they're hitting you for 6 and you're discarding them. Now you get to a point eventually where you have only 2k counters and radical beams left in your hand, and you cannot be afraid to discard those 2ks to block an attack that's just 1k, that can be blocked by a 1k. So I'm going to quickly go over some things that you can do to give yourself success in beating STRAWBEARD now. So firstly, let's talk about its worst matchups. Probably something like Kinemon, Mirror Match, or Zephyr. Now, the Mirror Match is pretty skill based aside from opening Newgate. Like, if one guy doesn't open Newgate, the skill kind of goes out the window there. But for the most part, it is pretty skill based. You need to know when to trade board. You need to know when to go face, when to bait. There's a lot of important things. When to save your board, right? So honestly, you need to mull there for Newgate though. Absolutely has to be done. As for Zephyr, I would say don't be too worried about it, especially in a big tournament. For the most part, the good players are going to be on decks like Strawbeard, Zoro, and Kinemon, maybe even Smoker, but unlikely. So it's very unlikely that you're going to run into a good Zephyr player. But to beat the deck, basically, again, they have 4 life, so going face is the most important thing. You want to see Vistas, you want to see Nami in your opening hand. It's pretty straightforward. Now, I'll talk about opening Nami and how important Nami is in the green matchup, because it is probably the most important card to open in the green matchup. I would say if you open Nami and not Newgate, to keep the hand, because you're likely going to see a Newgate by the end of the game, whereas playing Nami on your first turn is just so critical. It's so important because you can use it to trade into cards like Bonnie and Momo in the green matchup, right? If they play a Bonnie and you don't have that, or a Momo, sorry, and you don't have that Nami to trade into it, you're either forced to use your leader to trade into it, or not trade into it at all and go face. Right? Now, if you decide to leave the Bonnie or leave the Raizo, like cards like those, they're getting free cards every turn. And that's exactly how you beat the deck with green, right? You want to mull into a hand that's something like this. You know, you want to see a Searcher, a Raizo or Okiku, a Yamato, and an Odin, right? The Momo and the Raizo or Okiku are going to win you the early game. They're going to be adding cards to your hand every turn, and it's going to force Strawbeard to trade into them and not at your life, which is so important. Now, the Okiku and the Yamato are going to be chipping away at their hand for 6 every turn. Just swing for 6 every turn. Doesn't have to be 7, doesn't have to be 8. Just straight 6s until they have no 1k counters left, which should be pretty quickly, and now all of a sudden they're pitching 2k counters out of their hand every turn, right? And the most important thing to do with this deck is drop the Odin on 7 Dawn. If you go first as green and you drop Odin on your 7 Dawn turn, which means you need to make your board open for it, I promise you, you will win 70% of your games, unless you completely butcher the early game, in which I take that promise back. But you should be able to win 70% of your games. If you are dropping Odin on 7 Dawn, you are doing a tremendous amount of damage to them in the next 2 turns before they can drop their Newgate. It is just so important for that matchup. So for Zoro, guys, you probably want to see something like this. So Nami is important, along with a card that can pump her up, like Magra here or Makino, as well as a Newgate for turn 9. I would say that Nami, Newgate are the 2 most important cards to see. Newgate definitely takes priority over everything. If you have 2 Newgates, it's great. That can definitely win you the matchup, but you need to see one in your opening hand. I would mull for it for sure. The Nami is significantly more important than opening Dadan, because Dadan needs at the very least 2 Dawns to attack the leader, right? Assuming you have 1 Dawn on your Zoro leader. So that's exactly how you win the matchup. You need to keep swinging for 6, right? So if you play Dadan, yeah, it'll net you another card, but the Nami can be pumped up, but like I said, by Magra or Makino. So that's a 1 Dawn commitment to make your Nami 6k and hit their leader. Whereas Dadan needs 1 on your leader plus the 2 on the Dadan itself. So one of the most important ways to win this matchup is by paying attention to what cards your opponent is discarding. If you attack for 6 and they discard a 2k, that is very important for you to be paying attention to. It just gives you so much info about what's in their hand. You know that they likely don't have a Frankie or a 4-cost Luffy, and if it's later in the game, you're probably going to be soon met with an Ace or a Rush Luffy. If they use a Radical Beam to defend what they could be using a 1k counter to defend with, which does happen sometimes, you now know that you should never be attacking for anything more than 6k from this point. Another thing to remember is that they can bluff Dawn. It's important to realize that this deck plays a lot of 2k counters, right? But it also plays a lot of cards that have 0 counter. Just because they have 8 cards in hand and 3 done up does not mean that they can counter out of your next attack. So I feel like a lot of my thoughts are just jumbled up in this video because I'm trying to share both sides of the deck with you guys. And I'm trying to keep it as short as possible, so I'm going to reiterate my thoughts on beating the deck in these 5 different steps. So number 1 is chip away at their hand as much as possible with 6k attacks. Number 2 is defend as much as possible in the early game. 2k counters from their 6k leader attacks are so high value. Number 3, try your best to play big units on curve. Number 4, try to keep their board as clear as possible. And lastly, number 5, try out the deck in real life or on the sim and see it from their point of view. You can learn so much from a different point of view, so much more than you would even imagine. So I hope if you guys take anything away from this video, it's those last 5 points, and I hope it does help you in your future games. So please go ahead and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. I do appreciate the support, everybody, so thanks again.